The gunshot echoed through the mountain valley like thunder, and Martha Brooks felt the bullet tear through the wooden doorframe inches from her swollen belly. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she pressed her back against the cabin wall, one hand instinctively protecting her unborn child, the other gripping the rifle Jeremy Flores had taught her to use just days before. Outside, she could hear the voices of the three men who had tracked them here, their words carrying on the bitter wind that howled through the pine trees. "Come out, woman! We know you're in there with that murderer." The voice belonged to Henry Price, the man who had destroyed her life 6 months ago when he'd falsely accused her late husband of cattle rustling. Now he wanted to finish what he'd started, and the baby growing inside her made her an easy target. She could feel the child moving restlessly, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them both. Jeremy's voice came from somewhere near the back of the cabin, low and steady despite the circumstances. "Martha, stay down. I'm going to try to get around behind them." She wanted to call out, to tell him not to risk himself for her, but she knew better than to give away his position. In the 3 weeks she had been living in his remote mountain cabin, she had learned that Jeremy Flores was a man of few words but decisive action. Unlike every other person in the valley below, he had not judged her for her circumstances or turned her away when she had nowhere else to go. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending snow swirling against the windows. Winter had come early to the high country this year, and the storm that had been threatening for days was finally beginning in earnest. Martha closed her eyes and tried to remember how she had ended up here, 8 months pregnant and hiding in a stranger's cabin while armed men hunted her through the wilderness. It seemed like a lifetime ago that she had been living peacefully in the town of Cedar Falls, married to Thomas Flores and expecting their first child. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The story of how Martha Brooks came to be fighting for her life in Jeremy's mountain cabin began on a cold October morning when her world fell apart completely. The knock on her door that morning had been sharp and official, the kind that made her stomach clench with worry even before she opened it. Sheriff Donald Evans stood on her porch with his hat in his hands and an expression that told her everything she needed to know before he spoke a single word. Behind him, the autumn leaves were falling like tears from the oak tree that Thomas had planted when they were first married. "Mrs. Flores, I'm afraid I have some difficult news about your husband." The sheriff's voice was gentle but firm, the tone of a man who had delivered too much bad news over the years. "There was an accident at the mine. Thomas didn't make it out." The words hit her like a physical blow, and she had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling. Thomas had only been working at the copper mine for 3 months, taking the dangerous job because they needed the money to prepare for the baby. He had promised her he would be careful, that he would come home safely every night to feel their child kick and to plan for their future together. "How?" The word came out as barely a whisper, but Sheriff Evans heard it. "Cave in on the lower level. He was trying to help some of the other men get out when the supports gave way. He saved 4 lives, Martha. He died a hero." The sheriff's words were meant to comfort, but they only made the pain sharper. She didn't want Thomas to be a hero. She wanted him to be alive, to be there when their baby was born, to grow old with her in the little house they had built together. The days that followed were a blur of grief and practical concerns. The mine company offered a small settlement, barely enough to cover the funeral expenses and a few months of living costs. The other miners' wives brought food and offered condolences, but Martha could see the relief in their eyes that it had been Thomas and not their own husbands who hadn't come home. She understood their feelings, but it didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. By November, the money was running low, and Martha was beginning to show. The baby had grown large enough that her condition was obvious to everyone in town, and with it came the whispered conversations and sideways glances she had been dreading. In a small community like Cedar Falls, a pregnant widow was an object of both pity and suspicion, especially one who couldn't afford to maintain the appearance of proper mourning. Henry Price owned the largest ranch in the valley and most of the businesses in town, including the general store where Martha had to buy her supplies. She had never liked the man, finding him crude and overbearing, but she had tolerated him because Thomas had done business with him occasionally. After Thomas's death, however, Price's behavior toward her changed in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. "You know, Martha, a woman in your condition shouldn't be living alone," he had said one afternoon when she came to buy flour and sugar. His eyes lingered on her growing belly in a way that made her skin crawl. I've been thinking about your situation, and I might have a solution that would benefit both of us. Martha had tried to keep her voice steady and polite. That's very kind of you, Mr. Price, but I'm managing just fine on my own. Are you, though? His smile was cold and calculating, because from where I stand, it looks like you're barely scraping by. That baby's going to need a father, and you're going to need a man to take care of you. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer. The implication in his words made Martha's stomach turn, but she forced herself to remain calm. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not interested in remarrying. Not so soon after losing Thomas. Price's expression hardened. That's a shame, Martha, because I don't think you fully understand your position here. This town has a long memory, and people are starting to talk about your husband's accident. Some folks are wondering if maybe Thomas wasn't quite the hero everyone thought he was. The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. What are you trying to say? I'm saying that accidents happen for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes a man gets careless because his mind is on other things. Sometimes he takes risks because he's desperate for money. And sometimes Price leaned closer, his breath hot against her face. Sometimes a man dies because he's been stealing from his employer and knows he's about to be caught. Martha stepped back, her heart pounding. Thomas never stole anything. He was an honest man. Was he? Because I've been going through some of my records, and I'm finding some discrepancies in the cattle counts from when he worked for me last spring. Seems like some of my stock went missing right around the time your husband was helping with the roundup. Price's voice was smooth as silk, but Martha could hear the malice underneath. Now, I'm not saying Thomas was definitely a thief, but if that information were to come to light, it would certainly change how people remember him. And it might make them wonder what kind of woman would marry a cattle rustler. The accusation was so outrageous that Martha almost laughed, but the serious expression on Price's face stopped her. She realized with growing horror that he was not making an idle threat. He was prepared to destroy Thomas's reputation and her own if she didn't give him what he wanted. You're lying, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Am I? Are you willing to bet your reputation and your child's future on that? Price straightened his vest and smiled. Think about my offer, Martha. A comfortable life, a father for your baby, and your husband's good name preserved. All you have to do is be reasonable. Martha left the store without buying anything, her hands shaking as she walked home through the cold afternoon air. She spent the rest of the day trying to convince herself that Price was bluffing, that no one would believe such lies about Thomas. But as the weeks passed and she began to notice the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, the way some of the other women avoided meeting her eyes, she realized that Price had already begun spreading his poison. The first direct confrontation came in early December, when Mrs. Angela Brooks, the banker's wife and the unofficial leader of the town's social hierarchy, stopped her outside the church after Sunday service. Martha, dear, I think we need to have a little talk. Angela's voice was syrupy sweet, but her eyes were cold as winter ice. Some of us have been discussing your situation, and we're concerned about the example you're setting for the other young women in town. Martha pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to hide the obvious swell of her pregnancy. I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Brooks. Oh, I think you do. A young woman living alone, expecting a child, refusing perfectly reasonable offers of help from respectable men in the community. Angela's smile was sharp as a blade. People are beginning to wonder about your judgment, dear, and about your late husband's character. The words hit Martha like a slap, but she forced herself to stand straight and meet Angela's gaze. My husband was a good man who died trying to save others. I won't listen to anyone suggest otherwise. Of course, dear, but you have to understand how things look. Thomas working at that mine when he had debts to pay, the accident happening so conveniently when certain discrepancies were about to be investigated. Angela shook her head with false sympathy. I'm sure there's a perfectly innocent explanation, but you know how people talk. Martha felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she realized the full scope of what was happening. Price wasn't just trying to force her into marriage. He was systematically destroying her reputation in Thomas's memory to make her so desperate that she would have no choice but to accept his offer. The other women in town, led by Angela Brooks, were helping him by spreading gossip and innuendo until the lies became accepted truth. "What do you want from me?" Martha asked, though she already knew the answer. "We want you to be sensible, dear. Accept Henry Price's proposal. Give your child a name and a future. And most importantly, stop embarrassing this community with your stubborn pride." Angela's voice dropped to a whisper. "Because if you don't, I'm afraid things are going to get much worse for you. Much worse indeed." That night, Martha lay awake in the bed she had shared with Thomas, feeling the baby move restlessly inside her as if responding to her distress. She tried to think of options, of ways to escape the trap that was closing around her, but every path seemed blocked. She had no family to turn to, no friends who would stand against the combined pressure of Price and the town's social leaders. Her savings were nearly gone, and in her condition, no one would hire her for any kind of work. The next morning brought fresh snow and a visit from Sheriff Evans that confirmed her worst fears. He stood in her doorway looking uncomfortable, his badge gleaming dully in the gray morning light. "Martha, I hate to bother you, but I've received some serious allegations about Thomas that I need to investigate." His voice was apologetic but official. "Henry Price has filed a formal complaint claiming that your husband stole cattle from his ranch last spring." Martha's knees went weak, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "Sheriff, you knew Thomas. You know he would never steal anything." "I'd like to believe that, Martha, I truly would. But I have to follow the evidence, and Price has documentation that's pretty damaging. Bills of sale that don't match his inventory. Witness statements about Thomas being seen with cattle that weren't accounted for." Evans removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair. "I'm not saying I believe it, but I have to investigate." "What does this mean for me?" "Well, if the allegations prove true, any property Thomas owned could be subject to seizure to pay restitution. This house, any savings you might have, even personal belongings." The sheriff's expression was genuinely pained. "I'm sorry, Martha. I know this is the last thing you need right now." After Evans left, Martha sat at her kitchen table and tried to think clearly, despite the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She understood now that Price had planned this carefully, creating a web of lies and false evidence that would be almost impossible to disprove. Even if she could somehow clear Thomas's name, the legal process would take months or years, during which time she would be destitute, and her baby would be born into poverty and scandal. The solution Price was offering became more attractive with each passing day, not because she wanted it, but because she was running out of alternatives. A comfortable home, financial security, a father for her child, and an end to the whispered accusations that followed her wherever she went. All she had to do was marry a man she despised and live with the knowledge that she had been bought and sold like cattle. The breaking point came 3 days before Christmas, when Martha went to the general store to buy supplies with the last of her money. The store was crowded with holiday shoppers, and she tried to move quickly and quietly, hoping to complete her business without attracting attention. But as she reached for a bag of flour, she heard Angela Brooks' voice carrying clearly across the store. "I heard Sheriff Evans was at her place again yesterday. They say he's found evidence that her husband was definitely stealing cattle." Angela's voice was pitched just loud enough to ensure that everyone in the store could hear. "Honestly, I don't know why she doesn't just accept Henry's offer and spare us all this embarrassment." Another woman's voice joined the conversation. "Maybe she thinks she can find someone else willing to take on a thief's widow and bastard child." The cruel laughter that followed the comment hit Martha like a physical blow. She dropped the bag of flour, which burst open and scattered white powder across the wooden floor. The entire store fell silent as everyone turned to stare at her, some with pity, others with barely concealed contempt. Martha looked around at the faces surrounding her, people she had known for years, neighbors who had attended her wedding and brought food when Thomas died. Now they looked at her as if she were something shameful, something to be whispered about and avoided. She felt the baby kick hard against her ribs, as if responding to her emotional distress. Without a word, Martha turned and walked out of the store, leaving the spilled flour behind. She made it halfway home before the tears started, and by the time she reached her front door, she was sobbing uncontrollably. The combination of grief, humiliation, and fear for her unborn child's future had finally broken through the wall of strength she had been trying to maintain. That evening, as the snow fell heavily outside her windows, Martha made a decision that she knew would haunt her for the rest of her life. She would accept Henry Price's proposal, not out of love or even affection, but out of sheer desperation. She would sacrifice her own happiness and dignity to ensure that her child had a chance at a decent life, even if it meant living with a man who had destroyed her husband's reputation to get what he wanted. But as she prepared to write the letter that would seal her fate, Martha heard something that made her pause. It was the sound of horse hooves on the snowy road, moving slowly and deliberately toward her house. She peered through the curtains and saw a lone rider approaching, a tall man on a dark horse, barely visible through the swirling snow. The rider stopped at her gate and dismounted, moving with the careful economy of motion that suggested experience with harsh weather and difficult terrain. As he approached her door, Martha could see that he was a stranger, someone she had never seen in Cedar Falls before. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and weathered features that spoke of years spent outdoors. His clothes were practical rather than fashionable, the kind worn by men who worked with their hands and lived close to the land. When he knocked on her door, the sound was polite but firm. Martha hesitated for a moment, then opened the door just wide enough to speak to him. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I'm looking for Thomas Flores. I was told he lived here." The stranger's voice was deep and quiet, with an accent she couldn't quite place. Martha felt her throat tighten at the mention of her husband's name. "Thomas is dead. He died in a mining accident 3 months ago." The man's expression changed, showing genuine surprise and sorrow. "I'm very sorry for your loss, ma'am. Thomas was a good man. He saved my life once, and I came here to thank him and to repay a debt I owed him." Something in the stranger's manner, the sincere relief in his voice when he spoke of Thomas, made Martha open the door a little wider. "You knew my husband?" "Yes, ma'am. We served together in the war, in the same cavalry unit. My name is Jeremy Flores, and Thomas was like a brother to me." He paused, studying her face in the lamplight that spilled from her doorway. "You must be Martha. Thomas wrote to me about you, about how happy he was and how much he was looking forward to becoming a father." The mention of the baby made Martha's hand move instinctively to her swollen belly, and she saw Jeremy's eyes follow the gesture. His expression remained respectful and kind, without the calculating look she had grown used to seeing in other men's faces. "I don't mean to intrude on your grief, Mrs. Flores, but I wonder if I might ask you about the circumstances of Thomas's death. Something about your letter didn't sit right with me." Jeremy's voice was careful, as if he was trying not to cause her additional pain. "My letter?" Martha was confused. "I didn't write to you." Jeremy reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "This came to me about a month ago, addressed in what I assumed was your handwriting. It told me about Thomas's death and suggested that I might want to know the truth about what really happened at the mine." Martha took the letter with trembling hands and read it by the light from her doorway. The handwriting was feminine but not her own, and the content made her blood run cold. The letter claimed that Thomas had been killed not by accident, but by men who wanted to silence him, and that his widow was in danger from the same people who had murdered her husband. "I didn't write this," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then who did? And why would they want me to come here?" Jeremy's eyes were sharp and intelligent, and Martha could see him processing the implications of the situation. Martha looked at the stranger standing in her doorway, this man who claimed to have known and cared for her husband, and made a decision that would change everything. "Mr. Flores, I think you'd better come inside. There are things you need to know about what's been happening in this town since Thomas died." Over the next hour, Martha told Jeremy everything. She explained about Henry Price's accusations, about the false evidence of cattle rustling, about the pressure from the town's leaders to accept Price's proposal. She described the systematic campaign to destroy Thomas's reputation and force her into a marriage she didn't want. Jeremy listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail. When she finished, Jeremy was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that crackled in her fireplace. Finally, he spoke, and his voice carried a cold anger that made Martha shiver. Thomas told me about Henry Price in his letters. Said he was a man who took what he wanted and didn't care who got hurt in the process. But I never imagined he would go this far. Jeremy turned to look at Martha, and she could see something dangerous in his eyes. Mrs. Flores, I think your husband was murdered. And I think whoever wrote that letter knows it too. The words hit Martha like a thunderbolt. She had been so focused on the accusations against Thomas, so consumed with her own desperate situation, that she had never questioned the official story of his death. But as Jeremy spoke, pieces of a larger puzzle began to fall into place. The mine accident happened right after Price started making his accusations, Martha said slowly. Thomas was upset about something the night before he died. He said he had learned something important, something that would clear his name, but he wouldn't tell me what it was. And now he's dead, and you're being forced to marry the man who destroyed his reputation. Jeremy's voice was grim. Mrs. Flores, I don't think you're safe here. If Price was willing to kill Thomas to get what he wanted, he won't hesitate to hurt you if you continue to resist him. Martha felt the baby move inside her, a strong kick that reminded her of the life she was carrying and the responsibility she had to protect it. But where can I go? I have no money, no family, and I'm 8 months pregnant. I can't just disappear into the wilderness. Jeremy was quiet for another long moment. Then he looked at her with an expression that was both determined and gentle. I have a cabin up in the mountains, about a day's ride from here. It's isolated and defensible, and I know the country well enough to keep anyone from finding us if they come looking. You could stay there until the baby is born, and we figure out a way to prove what really happened to Thomas. The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Martha could barely process it. You don't even know me. Why would you risk yourself to help me? Because Thomas saved my life, and because I owe him a debt I can never fully repay. But more than that, Jeremy's voice softened, because what's being done to you is wrong, and because I've seen what men like Henry Price do to innocent people when no one stands up to them. Martha looked into Jeremy's eyes and saw something she hadn't seen in months, genuine kindness without ulterior motives. Here was a man offering to help her not because he wanted something from her, but because it was the right thing to do. The contrast with Henry Price's manipulative generosity was stark and telling. If I go with you, they'll say I've run away with another man. They'll use it as proof that I'm exactly what they claim I am. Martha's voice was heavy with the weight of their impossible choices. Let them say what they want. The people who matter will know the truth, and the people who don't matter have already made up their minds anyway. Jeremy stood up and moved toward the window, peering out at the snow that continued to fall. Mrs. Flores, I won't lie to you. It won't be easy. My cabin is comfortable but basic, and winter in the mountains is harsh. But you'll be safe, and your baby will be born free from the poison that's infected this town. Martha closed her eyes and tried to think clearly. Every rational part of her mind told her that going with a stranger into the wilderness was madness, especially in her condition. But every instinct she had told her that Jeremy Flores was telling the truth, that he was offering her the one thing she desperately needed, a chance to escape the trap that had been closing around her. When would we leave? She asked quietly. Tonight, if possible. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes. Price will be expecting an answer to his proposal soon, and when he doesn't get the one he wants, he's likely to take more direct action. Jeremy turned back to face her, and Martha could see the urgency in his expression. Pack only what you absolutely need. We'll have to travel light and fast. Martha spent the next hour gathering her most essential belongings while Jeremy prepared his horse and kept watch for any signs of trouble. She packed warm clothes, a few precious mementos of Thomas, and the small amount of money she had left. Everything else, all the physical reminders of the life she had built with her husband, would have to be left behind. As she folded Thomas's letters into her traveling bag, Martha found herself thinking about the mysterious note that had brought Jeremy to her door. Someone in Cedar Falls knew the truth about what had happened to Thomas, someone who cared enough to try to help but was too afraid to act openly. The thought that she might have an unknown ally in the town gave her a small measure of comfort as she prepared to leave everything familiar behind. Jeremy appeared in her doorway as she finished packing, his expression tense with urgency. We need to go now. I saw lights moving near the edge of town, and I don't think it's a coincidence that someone's out on a night like this. Martha took one last look around the home she had shared with Thomas, memorizing the details she might never see again. The kitchen where they had planned their future over morning coffee, the bedroom where they had dreamed about their coming child, the sitting room where Thomas had held her and promised that everything would work out. Now she was leaving it all behind to trust her life and her baby's future to a man she had known for only a few hours. The journey to Jeremy's cabin was a nightmare of cold, exhaustion, and fear. The snow had turned into a full blizzard, making travel treacherous and visibility almost zero. Martha rode behind Jeremy on his horse, clinging to him for warmth and stability as they climbed higher into the mountains. The baby seemed to sense the stress and movement, kicking and shifting constantly in a way that made Martha worry about premature labor. Several times during the long night, Jeremy had to stop and listen carefully to the wind, making sure they weren't being followed. Each pause filled Martha with terror that Henry Price and his men had discovered their escape and were tracking them through the storm. But each time Jeremy would nod and urge the horse forward again, his confidence in his ability to navigate the treacherous mountain paths never wavering. Dawn was breaking gray and cold through the snow-laden clouds when they finally reached Jeremy's cabin. It was larger than Martha had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney and shuttered windows that spoke of someone who understood how to survive harsh winters. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and Martha realized that Jeremy must have left a fire burning when he departed for Cedar Falls. "Welcome to your new home, at least temporarily," Jeremy said as he helped her down from the horse. Martha's legs were so stiff from the cold and the long ride that she could barely stand, and Jeremy had to support her as they made their way to the cabin door. Inside, the cabin was warm and surprisingly comfortable. The main room contained a stone fireplace with a fire crackling cheerfully, a solid wooden table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with books and supplies. A ladder led to a loft area that Martha assumed served as Jeremy's bedroom, while a smaller room off the main area appeared to be set up as a guest space. "You can have the downstairs room," Jeremy said, following her gaze. "It'll be warmer and easier for you to manage, especially as you get closer to your time." Martha sank into one of the chairs by the fire, feeling the warmth begin to penetrate her chilled bones. For the first time in months, she felt truly safe, protected not just by the solid walls of the cabin, but by the presence of a man who had asked nothing from her except the chance to help. "Jeremy," she said quietly, "I need you to know that I can't pay you for this. I have almost nothing left, and I don't know when or if I'll ever be able to repay your kindness." Jeremy was adding wood to the fire, and he didn't turn around when he answered. "Thomas saved my life at Antietam, pulled me out of a creek after I took a bullet in the leg and couldn't walk. I would have died there if he hadn't risked his own life to help me." He straightened and looked at her, his expression serious but gentle. "Mrs. Flores, you don't owe me anything. If anything, I owe Thomas a debt I can never fully repay. Taking care of his wife and child is the least I can do." Over the following days, Martha began to settle into a routine that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Jeremy was a quiet man who spoke little, but seemed to anticipate her needs before she was even aware of them herself. He cooked simple but nourishing meals, kept the cabin warm and comfortable, and gave her space to grieve and process everything that had happened. The isolation that might have driven some people to despair was a blessing to Martha. For the first time since Thomas's death, she could think clearly without the constant pressure of hostile stares and whispered accusations. She could remember her husband as he really was, not as Henry Price's lies had painted him. And she could focus on the life growing inside her without fear of what kind of world she was bringing her child into. Jeremy proved to be surprisingly good company when he did choose to talk. He had traveled extensively before settling in the mountains, and he had a quiet way of telling stories that helped pass the long winter evenings. He never asked intrusive questions about her marriage or her feelings, but he was always ready to listen when she needed to talk about Thomas or her fears about the future. As the days turned into weeks, Martha began to notice changes in herself that went beyond the physical progression of her pregnancy. The constant tension that had gripped her since Thomas's death began to ease, replaced by a cautious sense of peace. She slept better, ate with more appetite, and found herself able to think about the future without the crushing weight of despair. Jeremy, for his part, seemed to take genuine pleasure in preparing for the arrival of the baby. He spent hours crafting a cradle from pine wood, carving delicate designs into the headboard with a skill that spoke of years of practice. He also began stockpiling supplies they would need for the birth, making careful trips down the mountain to trade with isolated homesteaders who wouldn't ask questions about a pregnant woman living in his cabin. "Have you thought about names?" Jeremy asked one evening as they sat by the fire, Martha knitting tiny clothes while he worked on the cradle. "Thomas and I talked about it before he died. If it's a boy, we wanted to name him after Thomas's father, who died when Thomas was young. If it's a girl," Martha paused, her hand stilling on the soft yarn, "we thought about Sarah after my mother." "Those are good names, strong names." Jeremy's voice was gentle, and Martha could hear the respect he had for her husband's memory in every word. As her pregnancy advanced into its final month, Martha found herself growing increasingly anxious about the practicalities of giving birth in such an isolated location. Jeremy had assured her that he had experience with difficult situations and that he would do everything possible to ensure her safety and the baby's. But she couldn't help worrying about all the things that could go wrong. What if there are complications? What if the baby comes early, or there are problems during the birth? Martha's fears came pouring out one night as a particularly fierce storm raged outside the cabin. Jeremy set down the book he had been reading and looked at her with steady, reassuring eyes. "Martha, I won't lie to you. There are risks, and I wish we had a doctor nearby. But women have been having babies in difficult circumstances for thousands of years, and most of the time, everything goes just fine. I've helped with births before, during the war, and in some of the remote places I've lived. I know what to do." His calm confidence helped ease some of Martha's fears, but she still found herself lying awake at night, listening to the wind howl through the trees and wondering if she had made the right choice in coming here. The baby seemed to sense her anxiety, moving restlessly and keeping her from getting the rest she desperately needed. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Martha heard the sound that would haunt her dreams for years to come: the distant howling of wolves. Jeremy had mentioned that there were wolves in the area, but hearing them so close to the cabin filled her with a primal fear that she couldn't shake. The sound seemed to echo her own sense of vulnerability, a reminder that she was far from civilization and dependent on one man's protection. The next morning, Jeremy found tracks in the snow around the cabin, confirming that a pack of wolves had indeed been investigating their territory during the night. He didn't seem particularly concerned, explaining that wolves rarely attacked humans unless they were desperate or cornered, but he did begin taking extra precautions to secure their food supplies and keep a loaded rifle within easy reach. "They're just curious," he told Martha as he reinforced the shutters on the windows. "As long as we don't give them a reason to see us as prey or competitors, they'll leave us alone. But it's better to be prepared." Martha nodded, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. The thought of wolves prowling around the cabin while she was helpless with a newborn baby terrified her in ways she couldn't articulate. But she also recognized that Jeremy's matter-of-fact approach to potential dangers was probably the healthiest way to deal with the realities of their situation. As February arrived and Martha entered her 9th month, the routine of their isolated life began to feel almost normal. She had grown comfortable with Jeremy's quiet presence, appreciating his respectful distance while also drawing strength from his steady reliability. He never made her feel like a burden or an intrusion, despite the fact that her presence had completely disrupted his solitary existence. One afternoon, as Martha sat mending clothes by the fire, she realized that she hadn't thought about Henry Price or the people of Cedar Falls for several days. The constant anger and fear that had consumed her for months had been replaced by a tentative sense of hope about the future. She still grieved for Thomas and always would, but she was beginning to believe that she might be able to build a good life for herself and her child, even under these unusual circumstances. "Jeremy," she said suddenly, "I want you to know that these weeks have been a gift. I know you didn't ask for the responsibility of taking care of a pregnant woman, but you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." Jeremy looked up from the harness he was repairing, his expression curious. "What's that?" "Peace, the ability to think clearly and plan for the future without being afraid all the time." Martha's voice was soft but firm. "Whatever happens next, I'll never forget that you gave me that." Jeremy's weathered face softened with something that might have been emotion, though he quickly looked back down at his work. You don't need to thank me, Martha. You've given me something too. What's that? A sense of purpose. I've been living up here alone for 3 years, and I was starting to wonder if I was just hiding from the world instead of living in it. Taking care of you and preparing for this baby has reminded me what it feels like to have something important to do. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship, a shift from polite coexistence to something deeper and more meaningful. They began to talk more freely about their pasts, their hopes, and their fears. Martha learned that Jeremy had been a drifter since the war ended, never staying in one place long enough to form lasting connections with other people. His decision to settle in the mountains had been motivated by a desire for solitude, but he was beginning to realize that complete isolation wasn't the answer to his restless spirit. For his part, Jeremy came to understand the depth of Martha's love for Thomas and her determination to honor his memory while still moving forward with her life. He never tried to compete with her dead husband's place in her heart, but he made it clear that he respected both her grief and her strength in dealing with impossible circumstances. As Martha's due date approached, Jeremy began making more frequent trips to check on their supplies and ensure that everything was ready for the birth. He had arranged for a midwife from a distant settlement to come if possible, but the winter weather made such arrangements uncertain at best. Most likely they would be on their own when the time came. The baby decided to arrive during the worst blizzard of the winter, a howling tempest that made travel impossible and cut them off completely from the outside world. Martha's labor began in the early hours of the morning, waking her from restless sleep with pains that quickly became too strong to ignore. Jeremy responded to her call with the calm efficiency she had come to expect from him, helping her to the bed he had prepared and gathering the supplies they would need. His hands were steady and sure as he assisted with the birth, his voice a constant source of encouragement during the long hours of labor. When Martha's daughter finally arrived, screaming lustily in protest at being forced from her warm cocoon into the cold mountain air, Jeremy wrapped her carefully in soft blankets and placed her in Martha's arms with a tenderness that brought tears to the new mother's eyes. She's perfect, Martha whispered, studying the tiny face that looked so much like Thomas's baby pictures. She's absolutely perfect. Jeremy smiled, and Martha realized it was the first time she had seen him look truly happy since she had known him. She's beautiful, Martha. Thomas would have been so proud. They named the baby Sarah as planned, and Jeremy proved to be as devoted to the infant as he had been to Martha during her pregnancy. He took turns walking the floor with her during the long nights when she was fussy, and he showed remarkable skill at soothing her when Martha was too exhausted to cope with the demands of new motherhood. The weeks following Sarah's birth were a time of adjustment and unexpected joy for all three of them. Martha recovered her strength slowly but steadily, while Jeremy seemed to bloom in his new role as protector and provider for a small family. The cabin that had felt spacious for two people became cozy and intimate with the addition of a baby, and the sound of Sarah's cries and coos brought a liveliness to the mountain retreat that it had never known before. But their peaceful existence was shattered one morning in late March when Jeremy returned from checking his trap lines with news that chilled Martha to the bone. There are men in the valley below asking questions about a pregnant woman who might have come this way during the winter. Jeremy's voice was tense with concern as he secured the cabin door behind him. I didn't let them see me, but I got close enough to hear them talking. One of them was Henry Price. Martha felt her blood turn to ice as the reality of their situation hit her. She had been so focused on the immediate challenges of pregnancy and childbirth that she had allowed herself to believe that Price might have given up his pursuit. But clearly, he had been waiting for winter to end before resuming his search, and somehow he had tracked them to this remote area. How many men? Martha asked, instinctively moving to check on Sarah, who was sleeping peacefully in her cradle. 3 that I could see, but there might be more. They're armed and they look like they mean business. Jeremy was already moving around the cabin, checking his weapons and securing the shutters. Martha, I need you to understand something. These men aren't here to negotiate or make deals. Price has invested too much in this campaign to destroy you, to let you escape now. Martha nodded, her mind racing as she tried to think of options. Can we run? Take Sarah and disappear deeper into the mountains? Not with a newborn baby. The weather's still too unpredictable, and Sarah's too young to survive that kind of exposure. Jeremy's expression was grim but determined. We're going to have to make a stand here. The thought of her innocent baby being caught in the middle of a violent confrontation filled Martha with a terror unlike anything she had ever experienced. But as she looked at Jeremy's resolute face and thought about everything he had already sacrificed to protect her, she felt her own resolve hardening. "What do you need me to do?" she asked quietly. Jeremy handed her a loaded rifle and showed her the best positions to fire from if the men tried to force their way into the cabin. "You're a good shot, Martha. I've seen you practice. If it comes to a fight, don't hesitate to defend yourself and Sarah." As they waited for the confrontation that seemed inevitable, Martha found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a respectable widow trying to maintain her dignity in the face of impossible circumstances. Now she was preparing to fight for her life and her daughter's future with a rifle in her hands and a man beside her who had become more important to her than she had ever imagined possible. The attack came at dawn the next day, just as Jeremy had predicted. Martha was nursing Sarah when she heard the sound of horses approaching the cabin, moving slowly and deliberately as if the riders were trying to remain undetected. Jeremy was already awake and positioned at a window, his rifle ready and his expression focused with the intensity of a man who had faced combat before. "Martha, take Sarah to the back room and stay down," Jeremy whispered urgently. "Whatever happens, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Martha wanted to argue, to insist on staying and helping him defend their home, but she knew that her first responsibility was to protect her daughter. She gathered Sarah and her blankets and retreated to the small back room, positioning herself where she could hear what was happening but remain hidden from any bullets that might penetrate the cabin walls. Henry Price's voice carried clearly through the morning air, arrogant and demanding as always. "Jeremy Flores, we know you're in there, and we know you have something that belongs to us. Send the woman out, and we might let you live." Jeremy's response was calm but firm. "Martha Flores is under my protection, Price. She's not going anywhere with you." "Mrs. Flores?" Price's voice took on a mocking tone. "Is that what she's calling herself now? That's interesting, considering her husband has been dead for months and she's been living in sin with you all winter." Martha felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger at the crude insinuation, but she forced herself to remain silent. She could hear Sarah beginning to fuss, sensing the tension in the air, and she rocked her gently while straining to hear the conversation outside. "What Martha calls herself is her business," Jeremy replied. "What's not your business is harassing a woman who's done nothing wrong except refuse to marry a man she despises." Price's laughter was harsh and ugly. "Nothing wrong. She's a thief's widow who ran away with another man while she was carrying her dead husband's bastard. I'd say that's plenty wrong by any decent person's standards. The only thief here is you, Price. You stole Thomas Flores's reputation to try to force his widow into marriage, and when that didn't work, you had him killed." Jeremy's voice carried a cold certainty that made Martha's heart race. "I know what you did, and I have proof." There was a long silence outside, and Martha could almost feel the tension building like a storm about to break. When Price spoke again, his voice had lost its mocking tone and become deadly serious. "You don't know anything, Flores. And even if you did, it wouldn't matter. Dead men tell no tales, and neither do the women who whore with them." The gunshot that followed was so loud that Sarah began crying in earnest, her wails mixing with the sound of splintering wood as bullets began tearing through the cabin walls. Martha crouched over her daughter, trying to shield her with her own body while the battle raged around them. Jeremy returned fire with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed and purposeful. Martha could hear him moving around the cabin, changing positions to avoid giving the attackers a fixed target. His military training was evident in the way he handled the situation, calm and professional despite the deadly circumstances. "Give it up, Flores!" Price shouted during a brief lull in the shooting. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Send the woman out now and I'll make your death quick." "The only person dying today is going to be you, Price." Jeremy's response was punctuated by another carefully aimed shot that drew a cry of pain from one of the attackers. The battle continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Martha lost track of time as she huddled in the back room, her world reduced to the sound of gunfire, the smell of gun smoke, and the weight of her crying daughter in her arms. She found herself praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, begging for Jeremy's safety and for some way out of this nightmare. Then, suddenly, the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the gunfire had been, because Martha had no way of knowing what it meant. Had Jeremy been killed? Had Price and his men retreated? Was this just a pause before the final assault? Martha, Jeremy's voice came from the main room, strained but alive. It's over. You can come out now. Martha emerged from the back room on shaking legs, still clutching Sarah to her chest. The cabin was a wreck, with bullet holes in the walls and furniture overturned from Jeremy's movements during the fight. Jeremy himself was standing by the window, blood seeping through his shirt sleeve, but otherwise apparently unharmed. Are you hurt badly? Martha asked, setting Sarah down in her cradle and moving to examine Jeremy's wound. Just a graze. I've had worse. Jeremy winced as Martha began cleaning the wound, but his eyes remained fixed on the window windows. Price is dead. So is one of his men. The third one ran when he realized he was outnumbered. Martha felt a mixture of relief and horror at the news. She was glad that the immediate threat was over, but the knowledge that men had died defending her filled her with a sickness she couldn't shake. What happens now? She asked quietly. Jeremy was silent for a long moment, considering their options. The man who got away will go back to Cedar Falls and tell everyone what happened here. They'll probably send a larger group next time, maybe even involve the territorial authorities. So we have to run. We have to disappear, at least for a while. I know places deeper in the mountains where no one will think to look for us. We can stay hidden until things calm down and people forget about this whole business. Martha looked around the cabin that had become her home, the place where her daughter had been born, and where she had found a peace she had never expected to experience again. The thought of leaving it behind and returning to a life of uncertainty and fear was almost unbearable. But as she watched Jeremy methodically preparing for their departure, gathering supplies and weapons with the same calm efficiency he had shown throughout their ordeal, Martha realized that her feelings about their situation had changed in ways she was only beginning to understand. This man had risked his life to protect her and Sarah, had given up his peaceful solitude to provide them with safety and comfort. More than that, he had become an integral part of their small family in ways that went far beyond mere obligation or duty. Jeremy, Martha said suddenly, I need to tell you something before we leave this place. He looked up from the pack he was filling, his expression curious but patient. When I first came here, I was running away from Henry Price and the lies he was spreading about Thomas. But I was also running away from the possibility of ever caring about anyone again. I thought that loving Thomas and losing him had used up all the love I had to give. Martha's voice was steady despite the emotion behind her words. But these months with you have taught me that the heart doesn't work that way. It doesn't run out of room for people who matter. Jeremy set down the pack and turned to face her fully, his weathered features showing a vulnerability she had rarely seen before. Martha, I need you to know that I never expected or asked for your feelings. I helped you because it was the right thing to do and because I owed Thomas a debt I could never repay. But somewhere along the way, you and Sarah became more important to me than my own life. His voice was rough with emotion. I love you, Martha. Not as a replacement for Thomas or as a temporary comfort, but as the woman you are right now in this moment. The words hung in the air between them, honest and raw and full of possibility. Martha felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that what she had been feeling for weeks, but had been afraid to acknowledge, was being reflected back to her in Jeremy's eyes. I love you too, she whispered. I love you for who you are and for what you've given me and Sarah. I love you for seeing me as more than just a victim or a burden. And I love you for making me believe that I deserve to be happy again. Jeremy crossed the small space between them and took her in his arms, holding her with a tenderness that spoke of deep emotion, carefully controlled. When he kissed her, it was with the reverence of a man who understood the preciousness of what he was being offered. Then we'll face whatever comes next together, he said quietly. As a family. The journey deeper into the mountains was difficult, but not impossible with Jeremy's knowledge of the terrain and his careful preparation. They traveled mostly at night, following game trails and avoiding the main paths that searchers might use. Sarah proved to be a remarkably good traveler, sleeping peacefully in the sling Martha had fashioned to carry her, and rarely crying during the times when silence was crucial. They found refuge in a series of caves that Jeremy had discovered years earlier, natural shelters that could be made comfortable with some effort and provided excellent concealment from anyone who might be looking for them. The caves were connected by narrow passages that allowed them to move between different chambers without exposing themselves to observation from outside. Jeremy worked tirelessly to make their temporary home as comfortable as possible for Martha and Sarah. He built fires in chambers where the smoke would be dispersed through natural vents, created sleeping areas with pine boughs and blankets, and established secure storage for their supplies. His attention to Martha's comfort and Sarah's needs never wavered, even under the most challenging circumstances. As spring turned to summer, their life in the caves took on a rhythm that was surprisingly peaceful despite the unusual circumstances. Jeremy hunted and foraged for food while Martha cared for Sarah and maintained their temporary home. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk about their hopes for the future, making plans for a life together that seemed increasingly possible as the weeks passed without any sign of pursuit. Sarah thrived in the mountain environment, growing stronger and more alert each day. She seemed to respond positively to Jeremy's gentle attention, often falling asleep in his arms when Martha needed rest. Watching him with her daughter, Martha was struck by how naturally he had taken to fatherhood and how much joy Sarah brought to his previously solitary existence. "She's going to be a mountain girl," Jeremy said one evening as he rocked Sarah to sleep while Martha prepared their simple dinner. "Look how she watches the fire and listens to the night sounds. She's not afraid of anything." Martha smiled as she watched her daughter's peaceful face in the flickering firelight. "She's safe and loved. That's all any child really needs to thrive. She's going to need more than that eventually. Education, other children to play with, a chance to see the world beyond these mountains." Jeremy's expression was thoughtful as he considered Sarah's future needs. "We can't hide up here forever, Martha. Someday we're going to have to find a way to build a normal life for her." Martha nodded, knowing he was right, but reluctant to think about leaving the safety of their mountain refuge. "Do you think it will ever be safe to go back to civilization? Will people ever stop looking for us? Henry Price is dead, and with him died the main driving force behind the campaign against you. His men might continue the search for a while out of loyalty or fear, but without his money and influence, they'll eventually give up and move on to other concerns." Jeremy's voice carried the confidence of a man who understood how such situations typically played out. "Give it a year, maybe two, and we should be able to start over somewhere new." The prospect of starting over in a new place with Jeremy and Sarah filled Martha with a hope she had almost forgotten how to feel. She could imagine them settling in a small town where no one knew their history, where Jeremy could use his skills as a craftsman and she could raise Sarah in peace. It wouldn't be the life she had originally planned with Thomas, but it would be a good life nonetheless. As autumn arrived and the first snows began to dust the high peaks, Jeremy made increasingly frequent trips down from the mountains to gather news and supplies. He had established contact with a few isolated homesteaders who were willing to trade goods and information without asking too many questions about a man traveling with a woman and baby. It was during one of these trips that Jeremy learned news that would change everything for them. He returned to the caves one evening with an expression that was equal parts relief and excitement. "Martha, I have something to tell you that I think you're going to want to hear," he said as he settled by their fire and accepted the cup of coffee she offered him. "Good news, I hope. We could use some." "The best. I spoke with a trader who came through Cedar Falls last week. According to him, there's been a major development in the investigation of Thomas's death." Jeremy paused, clearly savoring the moment. It seems that one of the miners who was in the shaft when it collapsed finally came forward with information about what really happened that day. Martha felt her heart begin to race as she realized the implications of what Jeremy was saying. What kind of information? The kind that proves Thomas was murdered. Apparently, this miner saw Henry Price's foreman, Ryan Lewis, tampering with the support timbers in the section where Thomas was working. When the collapse happened, Lewis made sure that Thomas was trapped while the other men were able to escape. Jeremy's voice was grim with anger. The miner was too afraid to speak up at the time because he knew Price would have him killed too. But with Price dead and Lewis fled to parts unknown, he finally felt safe enough to tell the truth. Martha sank onto a log they used as seating, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Jeremy was telling her. After months of living with the knowledge that her husband had been murdered, but being unable to prove it, the truth was finally coming to light. "What does this mean for us?" she asked quietly. "It means that Thomas's name has been cleared completely. The sheriff has officially declared the cattle rustling charges to be fabricated, and the territorial governor has ordered a full investigation into Price's business practices. More importantly for us, it means that you're no longer a fugitive or a suspect in anything. You're free to go wherever you want and live however you choose." The relief that washed over Martha was so intense that she began to cry. Months of fear and uncertainty finally finding release in tears of joy and gratitude. Jeremy moved to sit beside her and pulled her into his arms, holding her while she sobbed out all the pain and terror she had been carrying. "It's over, Martha. It's finally over." His voice was soft and full of love. "Thomas's reputation is restored. Sarah will grow up knowing that her father was a hero, and you can hold your head high anywhere you go." When Martha's tears finally subsided, she looked up at Jeremy with eyes that were bright with possibility. "So what do we do now? Where do we go from here?" Jeremy was quiet for a moment, considering their options. "That's up to you, Martha. We could go back to Cedar Falls if you want to reclaim your old life. We could settle somewhere completely new, where no one knows our history." Or, he paused, meeting her eyes with an expression that was both hopeful and uncertain, "we could find a preacher and make this family official before we decide where to build our future." Martha felt her heart skip a beat at the suggestion, but she also felt a moment of uncertainty about the propriety of remarrying so soon after Thomas's death. As if reading her thoughts, Jeremy continued gently, "I know it hasn't been very long since you lost Thomas, and I don't want you to feel pressured to make any decisions you're not ready for. But Martha, we've been living as a family for months now, and Sarah already thinks of me as her father. If you're willing, I'd like to make it official and give both of you my name and my protection for the rest of our lives." Martha looked at this man who had risked everything to save her, and her daughter, who had given them safety and love when they had nowhere else to turn. She thought about Thomas and the love they had shared, and she realized that he would want her to be happy, would want Sarah to have a father who loved her unconditionally. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I want to marry you, Jeremy. I want us to be a real family." Jeremy's smile was like sunrise after a long, dark night. He kissed her with a passion that spoke of months of careful restraint finally being released, and Martha felt herself responding with an intensity that surprised her. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard and looking at each other with eyes full of love and desire. "When?" Martha asked breathlessly. "As soon as we can find a preacher willing to perform the ceremony. I know of a settlement about 3 days' ride from here where the pastor is known for being discreet about the circumstances of the couples he marries." Jeremy's voice was husky with emotion. "We could be there by the end of the week if you're ready to leave the mountains." Martha looked around the cave that had been their home for so many months, the place where she had found safety and love and the strength to believe in her future again. She would miss the peace and isolation of their mountain retreat, but she was ready to rejoin the world and build a life with Jeremy that didn't require hiding or running. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "Sarah and I are ready to start our new life with you." The wedding took place in a small chapel in the settlement of Pine Ridge, with only the pastor and his wife as witnesses. Martha wore a simple blue dress that Jeremy had bought for her from the town's general store, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Sarah had helped Jeremy pick that morning. It wasn't the elaborate ceremony she had dreamed of as a young woman, but it was perfect in its simplicity and sincerity. When Jeremy slipped the plain gold band onto her finger and promised to love and protect her and Sarah for the rest of his life, Martha felt a completeness that she had never expected to experience again. This wasn't the desperate love of youth that she had shared with Thomas, but something deeper and more mature, built on mutual respect and tested by adversity. Sarah, now 6 months old and growing more alert and interactive every day, seemed to approve of the proceedings. She gurgled happily in Martha's arms during the ceremony and reached out to grab Jeremy's finger when he leaned down to kiss her forehead after kissing his new bride. After the wedding, they spent several days in Pine Ridge while Jeremy made arrangements for their future. He had decided to use some of his savings to buy a small farm in a valley about 50 miles away, far enough from Cedar Falls to avoid unwanted attention, but close enough to civilization to provide Sarah with opportunities for education and social interaction as she grew up. The farm came with a modest but solid house, good water rights, and enough land to support a small herd of cattle and some crops. It also had a workshop where Jeremy could practice his woodworking skills, creating furniture and other items to supplement their income from farming. Martha fell in love with the place the moment she saw it. The house was larger than Jeremy's mountain cabin, but still cozy and manageable, with a big kitchen where she could cook for her family and a sunny bedroom where Sarah could sleep safely. There was even a small garden plot where Martha could grow vegetables and herbs, something she had always wanted to do, but had never had the opportunity to try. "It's perfect," Martha said as they stood on the front porch, watching Sarah crawl around on a blanket Jeremy had spread on the grass. "It feels like home already." Jeremy wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on the top of her head. "It will be home, Martha. Our home, where we'll raise Sarah and maybe give her some brothers and sisters to play with." The suggestion of more children sent a warm thrill through to Martha's body. The idea of having Jeremy's babies, of expanding their little family and filling the house with the sounds of children's laughter, was more appealing than she could have imagined. "How many children do you want?" she asked, leaning back against his solid chest. "As many as you're willing to give me. I never thought I'd be a father, but watching Sarah grow and change has shown me how much joy children can bring to a life. If we're blessed with more, I'll consider myself the luckiest man alive." As autumn deepened into winter, the Flores family settled into their new life with remarkable ease. Jeremy proved to be as skilled at farming as he was at everything else he attempted, and Martha discovered that she had a natural talent for managing a household and caring for animals. Sarah continued to thrive, reaching all the milestones that marked her development from infant to toddler. The neighboring families were friendly but respectful of their privacy, accepting the story that Jeremy and Martha were newlyweds who had come from back east to start fresh in the territory. No one questioned the fact that Sarah was obviously older than their marriage, and if anyone suspected that there was more to their story than they were telling, they kept their suspicions to themselves. Martha found particular friendship with Julie Ruiz, the wife of a neighboring rancher who had also lost her first husband and remarried. Julie understood the complexities of building a new life while honoring the memory of a previous love, and she became a valuable source of advice and companionship for Martha as she navigated her new role as Jeremy's wife. "The heart is bigger than most people realize," Julie told Martha one afternoon as they watched their children play together in the Ruiz family's yard. "It doesn't diminish your love for Thomas to love Jeremy too. If anything, it honors Thomas's memory by showing that he chose well when he married a woman capable of such deep feeling." As spring arrived and brought new life to their farm, Martha realized that she was pregnant again. The discovery filled her with joy and a small measure of anxiety as she remembered the difficulties of her pregnancy with Sarah and the dangerous circumstances surrounding her birth. But Jeremy's reaction was one of pure happiness, and his excitement helped ease her worries about the challenges ahead. "This baby will be born in our own home, with a doctor nearby and everything we need to ensure a safe delivery," Jeremy assured her as he held her close in their marriage bed. "And Sarah will have a little brother or sister to love and protect." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Martha found herself enjoying the experience in ways she hadn't been able to with Sarah without the stress and fear that had dominated her first pregnancy. She could focus on the miracle of new life growing inside her and the joy of sharing the experience with a husband who was thrilled about every aspect of becoming a father again. Jeremy was even more attentive during this pregnancy than he had been during Martha's time carrying Sarah, if such a thing were possible. He took over all the heavy work on the farm, hired help for tasks that might be dangerous for Martha to perform, and spent his evenings reading to her and Sarah while Martha rested and knitted tiny clothes for the new baby. When their son was born on a warm summer morning, with the local doctor in attendance and Jeremy holding Martha's hand throughout the labor, it felt like the completion of a circle that had begun in tragedy and fear, but had ended in love and hope. They named the baby Thomas Jeremy Flores, honoring both Martha's first husband and the man who had become the center of their family's world. As Martha held her newborn son while Jeremy sat beside her on the bed with Sarah on his lap, She reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. From the depths of despair and the certainty that her life was over, she had found not just survival, but genuine happiness. The woman who had once been too afraid to leave her house for fear of whispered accusations was now the wife of a respected farmer and the mother of two healthy, loved children. "Are you happy, Martha?" Jeremy asked softly, his eyes full of love as he looked at his wife and children. Martha smiled, feeling a contentment that went deeper than mere happiness. "I'm more than happy, Jeremy. I'm grateful. Grateful for Sarah. Grateful for little Thomas. Grateful for this life we've built together. And most of all, grateful for you and the love that saved us all." Outside their bedroom window, the sun was setting over the mountains where they had once hidden in fear, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that promised another beautiful day ahead. In the distance, Martha could hear the lowing of their cattle and the sound of wind through the wheat Jeremy had planted in their fields. These were the sounds of a life well lived, a family well loved, and a future full of possibility. The woman who had once believed that no one could last a week in the harsh mountain country had not only survived, but thrived, finding strength she never knew she possessed and love she never thought she deserved. And in the arms of the man who had refused to let her face the cold alone, Martha Brooks Flores had discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with running towards something, but with refusing to run away.